Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why sometimes you remember something perfectly, and other times it just slips away, even if you just saw it? Well, this new study dives deep into how our brain holds onto information in working memory and what can make it better or worse. Today we're going to unpack a really interesting study that looks at how we can get better at remembering things we've seen, and what might be messing with our memory. The main question these researchers wanted to answer is about two things. First, how often we refresh or bring things back to mind in our working memory. And second, how things at the moment of testing can interfere with our memory. You know how sometimes you focus really hard on something and then you remember it better? That is kind of what they're getting at with these retro cues. Imagine you are shown a bunch of things, and then later a cue tells you which one to pay attention to again. This usually helps you remember that specific thing better. Now, what happens if you get not just one of these cues, but several, telling you to think about certain items multiple times? This is where the refreshing frequency effect comes in. The idea is that the more you refresh a memory by thinking about it, the better you'll remember it. Makes sense, right? But here is the twist. The researchers weren't entirely sure if this refreshing frequency effect was because refreshing actively strengthens the memory, or if it is more about protecting that memory from getting messed up. And messed up by what? That's where the second part of their study comes in: test display interference. Think about when you are trying to recall something. If there is a lot of other stuff happening that looks similar to what you are trying to remember, it can get confusing. That's interference. These researchers were really interested in whether refreshing helps our memories avoid this kind of interference. So they ran a series of 6 experiments to try and untangle this. For all of these, they made sure to register their plans beforehand and share all their data and how they analyzed it. That is great for transparency. In experiment 1, they wanted to see if the refreshing effect is about protection from interference. They had participants memorize the orientation of pointers shown in different spots. Then, during the time they were supposed to hold that memory, they got cues to refresh certain pointers, either 0, 1, or 2 times. The key part here was how they tested memory. In some trials, they tried to minimize interference, and in others, they deliberately created interference by showing a confusing display when it was time to answer. And what did they find? Well, in experiment 1, they actually didn't see a clear refreshing frequency effect. That was a bit surprising because this is something other studies have found. They did see that the test display interference made memory worse, but the refreshing didn't seem to help protect against it in this experiment. Since they didn't get a strong refreshing effect in experiment 1, they tried again in experiment 2, this time using colors instead of pointer orientations, and using a task setup very similar to a previous study by Souza and colleagues that did find the refreshing frequency effect. This time, they finally saw some evidence for the refreshing frequency effect. The more times a color was refreshed, the better participants remembered it. This is more in line with previous research. But interestingly, they still didn't find that this effect was explained by protection from interference. Even when interference was present, refreshing seemed to help, but they couldn't link it directly to avoiding interference. They thought maybe the task in experiment 2 was just too hard, leading to very high error rates. So in experiment 3, they made the task a bit easier, fewer items, longer encoding times, longer queue durations. The goal was to see if a clearer refreshing benefit would emerge, and if they could finally test the interference protection idea. They found some evidence for the refreshing frequency effect again, but it was less consistent than before. And importantly, they still didn't see memory performance suffer when test display interference was present. This lack of interference effect was a problem because it prevented them from testing their main hypothesis. Could refreshing protect against interference? At this point, the researchers were a bit concerned. The refreshing frequency effect they were seeing was often based on the difference between refreshing once versus twice, not always a smooth, gradual improvement with more refreshing. And importantly, they still couldn't find that refreshing protected against interference. They started to question if the refreshing frequency effect is really as robust as often believed, especially when you test it outside the typical lab setting or with a wider range of participants. This was a big puzzle. They thought, why aren't we seeing this interference effect that other studies have found, especially when the task setup is so similar to one where it was found? They identified 2 main differences between their experiments and the key study that found a strong interference effect: the length of the time between seeing the items and being tested. and the presence of these refreshing cues versus single cues. So in experiment 4, they decided to isolate one of these differences, the retention interval duration. They removed the refreshing cues altogether and compared a short 1000 milliseconds and a long 4500 milliseconds interval with and without test display interference. They found that a longer retention interval led to slightly worse memory, which makes sense because memories can fade over time. But again, they didn't replicate the test display interference effect. So it wasn't just the time delay that was the issue. Next, in experiment 5, they focused on the other difference, the type of cues. They wanted to test if refreshing cues were somehow masking the interference effect, or if a single retro cue, like the ones used in some previous studies, would reveal it. They used a setup similar to 2016 study by Souza and colleagues. This experiment was designed to see if a retro cue would protect memory from interference. They compared trials with and without a retro cue, and again with and without test display interference. And here they finally found something. When participants didn't get a retro cue, the test display interference did negatively impact their memory. But when they did get a retro cue, that interference effect disappeared. This suggests that the retro cue was indeed protecting the memory from interference. It also showed that the retro cue benefit itself comes from both protecting against interference and something else, as there was still a benefit even when interference was minimized. This was a crucial finding. It seemed like the interference effect was present, but perhaps it was being masked in their earlier experiments, especially when they used multiple refreshing cues. To confirm this, in experiment 6, they essentially reran the no cue condition from experiment 5. Their goal was simple: could they reliably see the test display interference effect when there were absolutely no other manipulations happening? No refreshing cues, just a standard memory test. And the answer was a resounding yes. They observed a clear negative impact of test display interference in this simplified setup. This strongly suggests that the interference effect is real, but some of the experimental manipulations they used in earlier experiments, like the refreshing cues, might have inadvertently masked it. So, what is the big takeaway from all these experiments? First, the refreshing frequency effect seems to be less robust and perhaps harder to replicate than once thought, especially with a broader range of people and online testing. Second, and perhaps more importantly, they found that test display interference does affect memory performance, but this effect can be hidden or masked by certain experimental designs, like the use of refreshing cues. However, when they simplified the task and used a single retro cue, they could see this interference effect clearly, suggesting that retro cues indeed protect memories from getting messed up at test time. It is a complex picture, and this research highlights how subtle changes in how we study memory can lead to very different results. It shows that even when we think we know something about how memory works, there is always more to uncover about the conditions under which those effects appear or disappear. My opinion and analysis, this study is a great example of the scientific process. The researchers started with a hypothesis about how refreshing memory might work, and when their initial experiments didn't fully support it, they didn't just give up. They systematically changed their approach, tested different ideas, and through that process, they uncovered something important: that interference is a real factor in memory retrieval, and our attention-directing strategies, like those retro cues, are crucial for protecting our memories. The fact that they couldn't get a strong refreshing frequency effect in some of their experiments is a valuable finding in itself. It suggests we need to be cautious about claiming robust effects based on a few lab studies. It makes you wonder about how this plays out in our everyday lives. If refreshing isn't as powerful as we thought, then focusing our attention, as shown with the retro cue, is perhaps the more critical factor in ensuring we remember what is important. What I find particularly interesting is how the presence of other cues, like the refreshing ones, might have been diluting the interference effect. It is like having too many people talking in a room. It is hard to hear the one important message. So, while the refreshing cues themselves might not have been protecting against interference in the way they hypothesized, the research did show that general attention-grabbing cues do provide that protection. For future research, it would be fascinating to explore why the refreshing frequency effect was so inconsistent across these experiments. Was it the specific materials, the participant pool, and could there be other common memory tasks or real-world scenarios where interference is actually a bigger problem than we currently account for? Understanding these masking effects is key to building a more complete picture of how our working memory truly functions. Overall, this is a really solid piece of research that pushes our understanding of visual working memory. It reminds us that scientific discovery is often a journey of refinement and careful testing. And sometimes the most important findings come from the questions we didn't initially set out to answer. What do you guys think about these findings? Do you find that refreshing anything mentally helps you remember it better, or is it more about focusing your attention when you need to recall something? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the science of memory, give this video a like, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.